Hi, this is Dr. Cesar Leavitt with another episode, the Way to College podcast. And, one of the amazing things about the podcast is the opportunity to share space with folks who have amazing stories. When I set out to do this, I wanted to share these stories with my students because I think a lot of them, one, had a very narrow view about what they could do with their lives and the paths they could take. And I think a lot of my students felt like there was one path and that was it. And I wanted to share the stories because I wanted them to see that there are multiple paths and multiple pathways to success. Um, and so I'm excited about today because today is another story in this collection of amazing stories. And so I'm excited about hearing this gentleman's story. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to let him introduce himself to our listeners and viewers out there. So, Carlos, would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners out there?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Saldivar. My name is Carlos Cardenas. Born and raised in Chicago. Full-time job. I'm a senior director of IT for a national credentialing organization. We certify and recertify nurse anesthetists. I'm a proud Marine Corps veteran. Served 4 years. Got out right before 9/11, and then after 9/11, raised my hand to go in another year. Um, and I'd like to volunteer. So I serve on various committees. Also, help co-found or found nonprofit organizations. And so, give a quick shout out to Association Latinos. Mission is to elevate, Latino leadership in the association profession. So I could go on and on, but that's a quick introduction. Thanks for having me, Dr. Saldivar.
Oh, no, thank you, Carlos, and I'm excited. As I said, I'm excited to hear more about your story, and we'll get to sort of that ethic, that volunteerism, and that service. So I'm excited to get into it. But before we do that, Carlos, I start every interview, every conversation with the same question, and that question is, if you had to identify a starting point for your educational journey, what would that starting point be for you?
If I look back, I would say there are probably multiple starting points, right? And I would probably call it an awakening of sorts, right? And so, even going through high school, I'm not sure if yeah, I was probably the most astute student, maybe not the most involved student, but kind of where it all kind of came together in terms of thinking about maybe the future and where education plays a role. I would say that is enlisting in the Marine Corps, right? And so coming from Chicago's little village neighborhood, not many opportunities. I saw military service as an escape, but you're on your own. You're in this new world. For me, it was, Okinawa, Japan. That was my first duty station. My family wasn't around. My friends were not around. I had to kind of stand up for myself. I had to compete. So I think at that point, I realized kind of the power of people coming together. And then at that point, I also could see like a future in terms of where education, was important. So fast forward a little bit, kind of getting out of the Marine Corps, enrolling in, community college courses. I always had a passion for mathematics. And so I felt like that opened up another world for me in terms of how to like look at things and perspective and the analytics of things. And I think that is where that first awakening happened in terms of education. Education for me was not a straight line. It took its turns, and we'll get to that. But I would say that was the first awakening in terms of like, this is what education can unlock for you in terms of controlling my own destiny. I'm in charge of my future. Like that was the first awakening.
I love that. I appreciate that, Carlos, because I think thinking about what you said about enlisting in the Marines, uh, when I talk to young people, and it's a really powerful narrative that we tell young people and kind of like frame life in these like stages, right? High school, and this is this critical stage, and I think a lot of students feel like, oh, if I miss it, if I miss this, then this doesn't happen and this doesn't happen. And so I appreciate you talking about like So I didn't enroll in college right after high school, right? I enlisted. That was a different decision. Nonetheless, it still led me to, right? Again, these different pathways that you talk about. Carlos, let me ask you, what was it? You talked about the freedom. You saw the military and the Marines as there was a freedom associated with it. But what else was it about enlisting that appealed to you?
I consider myself privileged in terms of, being able to experience an enlistment in the Marine Corps, two enlistments in the Marine Corps. I feel like it exposed me to the broader America, right? Folks that I normally would not be able to, like, insert your analogy, right? Be in a foxhole with, rub elbows with, or even just be have a relationship with, from all parts of the United States, even some immigrants, right? That was my first exposure to saying, like, some people actually enlist and give, 4 years or X number of years of their lives for a path to citizenship. So just kind of being exposed to that. And, I'll say most people that enlist in the Marine Corps probably don't have, are maybe underprivileged in terms of their normal. There's some that, have some privilege. And when I say privilege, I mean maybe access to resources, access to education. Maybe they want a challenge. But I think for the most part, from what the story that I was able to gather is that, people don't have a shot. Maybe they don't have the funds for college. Maybe they're a single parent. Maybe they're going away from a not an abusive father, but a strict father, right? Follow my rules. This is what I want for you, right? And teenagers tend to rebel, and maybe the Marine Corps is an outlet, or any military service. So I think that is why I say I'm privileged in terms of being exposed to that, and I think that has carried forward uh, probably throughout my entire life and where I'm at now. That's There's some formative things that happen in your life. That is definitely one of those formative experiences. It shapes the way that I see the world today.
I love that. I appreciate that. Thank you, Carlos. Um, you then led us to enrolling in a community college. Why was that important for you?
Again, I feel like once you getting out of the Marine Corps, you see yourself at a different tier. Excuse me. Maybe you see yourself at a different tier in life. And so kind of having challenged yourself against other Marines, you kind of see where you stand, right? Where you measure up. And we talked about the importance of education and that awakening. And so, I knew that I wanted to explore engineering. Um, Again, I was not the strongest in school, so I feel like there were some topics in mathematics that I had to brush up on. And so that was my path. That was the beginning of my journey. That was my path to an engineering degree. So community college, take some sort of, self-assessment, you can call it, probably some mathematics to see if you need to take algebra, geometry, trigonometry. And so enrolled in some courses and kind of trying to get back into trying to reacclimate into civilian life. Um, and so I took a couple courses, and then that, you know, transformed into a couple semesters. And then 9/11 happened. And so, I can recall exactly when that happened. I think I had class that morning. I think it was a trigonometry class. But seeing that on live TV, seeing it unfold, uh, I made the decision right there and then. Didn't know exactly how, but I was going to drop community college and I was going to try to find a way to get back into the Marine Corps. So that was my first stint, right? In terms of education, it was disrupted
Mhm.
for important reasons, but that was my first stint that was the reason why I went to community college. On the path to becoming an engineer, but it was disrupted for good purposes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One, thank you for your service. Two, we so often we're quick to frame, right, our educational experiences around a classroom, around an institution, and yet for all of the veterans that I've spoken to, it sounds like the military experience itself is an incredible education. And as you said, right, a lot of people go to college, and in college, that's where they first meet people that are different from them. And you talked about how that was your experience in the Marines and meeting people from, all over the world, different, religions, races, right, immigrants. Um, and so, you know, why was it? Why was it? Just as I'd asked you, why was it important, or what was it that attracted you to the Marines? And maybe this is a no-brainer, but I feel like I've got to ask, why re-enlist? Why was that significant, and why was that important for you?
I felt I had just separated from active duty in August 2000. And so I was still, my proximity to service was still there. The second part was the last place that I served was in Arlington, Virginia. And I believe the plane that flew into the Pentagon, went directly over the building where I used to serve, Navy Annex. It's no longer there. I think there's a memorial. And so the Marines that I served with, they were still there, right? And so some part of me just compelled me to say, again, I'm not an infantryman. I was not going to pick up a rifle. Rounds were not going to go down range. My background, my MOS was in comms. Just had to get back into it, however I could help, for the Marines that I served with. That was the purest reason in terms of why I had to go back, why I dropped everything without hesitation, some hesitation, but mostly without hesitation. That was what compelled me to go back into active duty service.
And you did this for a year?
I did this for a year.
Hmm.
So from September, I think October actually. So maybe a month later, I was already, in the going through the process of reenlisting. So going back and reactivated, you could say, into active duty service.
When that year was up, was it an easy transition? Was it just, let me pick up, let me get back into the classroom? What was the next step for you, and what was that transition like?
After that year, I had the choice of staying in longer. I probably could have made a career out of it. But I think family brought me back to Chicago. Um, and still, it took me a while to kind of readjust. Sometimes when you transition away from the Marine Corps, you kind of feel like an outsider. Your family sometimes can be like strangers, right? Because now you've had this experience, you've made these connections, and now you go back to being a civilian, and just something is different about you. Something is different about them. Not sure if I can fully articulate that, but it took me a while. Had my battles. It took me a while to readjust into, we say, the civilian life, right? And I think after that happened, I was just as determined to get back into that educational journey. And at that point, I finished my associate's degree, so went through all of the requisite classes, prerequisite classes, and I was still deficient in terms of in enrolling into an engineering program. We have UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, and so physics one, calculus one, two, three. I had to go to different community colleges after the associate's degree, to earn those credits and basically meet the requirements. Some 2, maybe 3 years later, um, I had those prerequisites. I applied for the College of Engineering at UIC, was accepted. At that point, it was like, wow, I'm in the thick of it, right? And a whole nother set of challenges kind of presented themselves.
Carlos, thank you for that. Let me ask you, you talked about that transition, and it was a difficult transition. You talked about going through your battles, and one of the beautiful things about the podcast and engaging and hearing people's stories is, um, I love the advice that people offer, and I'll often ask my guests, to offer some advice, because I never know who's listening, right? We don't know who's listening, and if they're a student, if they're maybe a veteran transitioning, into civilian life. But for somebody who is a veteran and who finds themselves in the midst of that transition, what advice would you give them?
I'll say that exiting or transitioning from military service, you probably think you can figure out things yourself, and you probably can, right, to a certain extent. But I hear from so many veterans how hard it is adjusting back to normal life for all of the reasons that I mentioned, and probably more, depending on their experience. Don't try to figure it out all by yourself. I think this is where, you probably seek groups. Others have walked in your shoes before you even, set foot right on down that path. So try to learn from them, right? Try seek them out. There are probably many groups that talk about this very challenge. And for the reasons that you just mentioned, maybe there's something that you hear that resonates with you, where it might save you X number of months or X number of years, just to say like, oh, I understand what this guy or girl is telling or saying, right? And so, maybe your path to reacclimating can be that much faster. If you try to figure it out on your own, you'll probably still get there. Maybe you won't. Um, but I feel like seek out the advice of others who have been there, who have done that, who have faced challenges. But at the end, right, they've come out, and they've readjusted, and maybe that just hearing that story can help your journey.
Thank you. And I think it's important, right? I think I don't know if it was in our conversation in the lead up to this, right? And that pre-call that we had, but there are always these themes that emerge from these conversations. And one of the themes, one of the reoccurring themes is my guests often encourage the listeners and people out there to develop these help seeking behaviors, right? To be
Yes.
comfortable asking for help, and that it's not, it's not a sign of weakness or beneath you to ask somebody, especially people whose job, right, it is to provide help and support for us. So thank you for kind of for talking about that and sharing your own experience with that. You you know, you readjust, you get into this program, and well, yeah, I often ask guests, like looking down the road, what is it that you were seeing for yourself? What is it that you wanted to achieve? You have this career in the Marines, or time in the Marines, you go back to school, and what was it that you were working towards?
I call this kind of the second awakening, right, in terms of the educational journey. And so, getting accepted into the College of Engineering, part of that is there's these expectations, right, that you, yeah, maybe your family brings them upon you, maybe society, maybe the Marine Corps brings them on you, but there's these expectations. And so, based on my MOS, based on those expectations, based on the expectations that I've placed on myself, I was on the path to becoming an engineer. So I saw myself, right? And so not an easy path, not at all, right? So again, these concepts where mathematics and physics come together, and again, just whole new world that opens up. I'm not sure if I was ready for it, to be honest, but I did see kind of, the importance, um, of this educational journey. Simultaneously, right, trying to earn a living, trying to pay the bills, trying to grow a life outside of that. I didn't have the luxury of, I mean, I had the GI Bill, but some of it, had run its course. And so some of it was like, how do I pay for this? So I had to put food on the table, I had to have, a place to stay. And so these extra burdens, right? And so, at some point they weigh on you, and you may have, and in my story, right, had a few years under my belt in terms of, on the path to becoming an engineer. I like to say kind of life got in the way. And so I had to step away from that. Came back a few times, took a few classes, got to a senior standing. Um, Life happened again. And so, I had the benefit of my employer helping subsidize some of those educational expenses. But then that option was no longer there, and left to my own, right, devices in terms of trying to figure out how do I pay for this, just didn't have the money. So yeah, I had to step away from that dream. Still saw myself in terms of, I guess I saw the world differently again, right? In terms of these two disciplines and the way that I look at systems. Um, so in terms of where did I see myself, I guess to answer your question directly, I did see myself as an engineer. I did not see in hindsight all of the challenges that I would encounter that would get in the way of me becoming an engineer. So long story short, senior standing, had to step away, had to get back into the workforce. Um, and my educational journey did not finish, but my story hasn't been completed yet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, that's one of the reasons why I do this, because again, right, we operate, I think when we're young, operating around these models and these ideas about this happens to here and this has to happen here. And here you are, you know, you're navigating life, you're navigating the challenges, and as you said, right, life happens, yet you continue to persist, you continue to come back, go to school, take a couple of classes, all the while navigating life. And I imagine throughout this process, did you get discouraged?
Absolutely. I mean, part of it is, did I not finish because of me? You go through that, am I not good enough type of thing? Am I not smart enough? Do I not have what it takes to be an engineer? So I think, if you don't meet your goals, that self-doubt starts to creep in. Um, I don't know if you overcome it, but you have to kind of fight it off, right? It's always there.
Yeah,
Um, and so you have to figure out a way to say, like, I didn't get it done, but I'm not done. And so I
absolutely.
feel like you have to reframe your failure and reframe it into how am I going to, not necessarily how am I going to convert this into a success story, but how am I going to overcome this challenge?
Yeah.
So that's how I look at it.
And so how did you reframe?
So I had to so I entered the workforce. I did have background. I like to experiment. I like to tinker. So information technology just revolved around technology, right? So now introducing some of these concepts that I had learned in terms of signals and systems and these larger kind of concepts in terms of, again, Marine Corps, all of these different people coming together for a purpose, for a mission. And, egos aside, there are egos in there, but we have a mission to accomplish. So again, I just volunteering, putting teams together, building teams from scratch. I was able to kind of leverage my experience. And I just felt like I had, even though I could say that I served in globally leading Marines, even though I could say that, I was an IT professional and I wasn't too bad. Um, Even though I could say that I was, leading volunteer teams, founding nonprofits, always in the back of my mind is that, man, I did not finish. There's still unfinished business, right? And so, at that point, it's always there. It's always there. It's always nagging at you. And, thankfully it didn't go away completely. And so I felt like, man, I like to talk the talk. I've got to get back in that classroom and I've got to finish what I started. Maybe not necessarily the same educational goals that I had before. And on the other side, not saying like I'll take any degree, but I had to kind of say like, well, what am I doing now? And what makes more sense for me right now? Because an electrical engineer, at that point in time, no longer made sense. So I had to kind of adjust and pivot.
I appreciate you saying that. Because I think, right, I think what you said was really important, because you said, right, what made sense at that point. So where you were, kind of assessing the situation, assessing where you're at, and figuring out, okay, does it make sense to do this if I want to continue in this field, right? And incredibly timely. I had a conversation last night. A friend of mine calls me and is like, should I do a doctoral in this field? But he wants to do this other stuff. Like, well, do the other thing. You don't need the doctor for for
Yeah.
that to do that work, right? So what do you need for that work? So here you are, you have this realization, you decide you're going to pivot, and so what came next for you, Carlos?
Yeah, so I had to figure out again as an adult learner, somebody who probably put in 50 hours of time in terms of my work week, normal job, and then my volunteer extracurriculars. Um, what was that educational institution that made sense for me? Um, after some digging, after some conversations, after some recommendations, Purdue Global kind of emerged as, wow, this is a good opportunity for me to take night classes on my time, right? And thankfully, a lot of my educational experience, a lot of the courses that I took, transferred over. So I didn't have to start from zero. I didn't even have to start from the halfway point. So a lot of them, transferred over, and I was able to finish the degree. I know I'm skipping a lot, but I could see the light at the end of that educational tunnel. And I think my journey from start to this is the third time I'm going back. I think it was about 15 months. And so as much as I don't want to use the word sucked, as many challenges as there were in terms
Yeah.
of again putting in sacrificing those weekends, sacrificing the night, sacrificing time with my family, missed a lot of events, missed a lot of different experiences, I would say. But I would say I was focused. um and in 15 months, I was able to finally walk that stage at Purdue Global, which is here in Indiana. I'm in Chicago. And this was in May of 2024. So it's almost been a year.
Wow. Wow. Congratulations.
No, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
What did that feel like to walk across that stage?
Part of me was like, pat myself on the back. Part of me was like, I did it. But, the other part, I felt like almost like an out of body experience, if I can call it that, right? So now I'm in, and not for me personally, right? I'm in this auditorium, and there are probably about 500 other people, probably more, who have a similar story to mine, and just kind of talking and hearing their stories. Again, I feel like that out of body experience was like maybe hovering over the auditorium and like listening to other people and their journeys, which, again, if I had to like describe it, some of them had even more challenges, more obstacles in their life, than I did, right? So I had a deeper sense of appreciation that I'm not the only one doing this. There are others that are still made the decision wherever they're at in their life, whatever economic opportunities they have or they don't have, however many, members of their family that they have, obviously raising a family. There's a story here as well.
Hmm.
Why do people do this, right? So I took myself out of that, and I'm just like, why do people do this? Why do people sacrifice the nights and the weekends, to get this degree, right?
Yeah.
And obviously some things are pretty straightforward, and you know why, but there's other things in terms of, man, I said I was going to do something 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and here I am, I finally did it, right? So I feel like you have to give yourself some grace.
Yeah.
Not the best thing in the world, obviously, right? I mean, to some people, yeah. I mean, to some extent, yes, it was for me, but more so that um, I set out to do something, I did it. I can, there's always that self-doubt that you carried with you because you don't have that degree. Some of that was gone, some of that still remained, but finally able to kind of, be done with it. And again,
Yeah.
education is a lifelong pursuit, but in terms of that particular chapter, I was able to turn the page.
Yeah. Well, again, congratulations on that journey and completing the task, right? You set this out for yourself. This was a goal for you like you said, 20 years ago, and then to see that through. Congratulations. I know
Thank you.
there are, it sounds like in hearing your story, there were a lot of moments where you could have stepped away and you could have said, you know what, this isn't for me, or whatever. How do I afford it? Right? You talked about that, but you persisted, you continued, you saw it through. So again, congratulations. Um, one thing that I wanted to ask, hearing your story, hearing what you've shared so far, you kind of glossed over, you talked about leading, right? Leading teams as a Marine, but you kind of glossed over these nonprofits. And I want to go back to that because I want to ask about, work. I feel like we work a lot of times because bills have to be paid, right? I've got to provide. If I've got a family, I've got to provide for the family. I've got to put food on the table. I've got to feed myself, right? But when we choose to get involved in a nonprofit and even to start a nonprofit, those are choices. Those are things we don't have to do. Why has that been? Because it sounds like service has been a part of your life. Why has that been so important to you?
Service does not end when the uniform comes off, right? Soon service continues. And I like to say that, and maybe it's true for any, somebody who has served. You find your new mission, you find your new purpose. And so I've always thought it was a privilege to lead Marines, to help people in their journey, right? And sometimes you're that junior Marine and you need help. And sometimes you're that, you know, senior Marine where you can help others. So, so founding a nonprofit, you basically recognize an opportunity. There's something there's a gap somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so, privileged to be able to come together with, four other Latinos, five including myself. And I guess here's the background story, the context behind that. Hispanic Heritage Month, we were asked, hey, five Latinos, right? Come together, let's talk about Hispanic Heritage Month. Let's also tie that to nonprofit association membership in terms of 1 to 2% representation. So I wasn't privy to that research before or those statistics, but right then and there, right, you could kind of see people's expressions and reactions. Like, if it's only 1 to 2%, we've got to do something about this. So a little bit fast forward on in terms of that conversation, but right then and there, I think the five of us came together and said, let's meet every week, right? Let's have these conversations. Let's see, there's something here. Maybe we weren't exactly sure what that something was, but the more that we talked, the more that, the opportunities and the challenges started to kind of uncover themselves. And so took us a little bit. We created a community on LinkedIn, gathered a little bit of a following, tried to kind of bring other Latinos together. We knew they were out there. We were just not kind of talking to each other. We were not aware. And so create the space for the community, create the space for people to kind of have conversations with each other. And then at some point it started to migrate into, how do we elevate the Latino? How do we put them in roles from a professional development perspective as subject matter experts? Because for leadership, we were just not there. We were not represented in nonprofit boards. We were just not there. We were not represented. Sometimes you have your token Latinos, we like to say, right? You get in there and you're comfortable being the only Latino. You might not help others come along. And so that was the opportunity, the challenge. And that's where we kind of refocused our mission. We incorporated as a nonprofit in 2000, I think it's 2021. And ever since then, we've started to gain some traction. Other affinity groups, started to gravitate towards and say like, hey, what are you guys? We like what you're doing here. Can we have a conversation, right? There are other groups where we want to kind of replicate this. And then we had 10 volunteers. Probably the first year we had that doubled to 20. This year it's doubled to a 40, almost 50, if you think about the board and
Wow.
committee members. So there's something here. People want to be heard. People want to network. People want opportunity. They want to learn from people who have been there. I talked about people having different on ramps in terms of their career. Um, People want that opportunity, and if given that opportunity, I think, as Latinos, it's in our culture. It's the way that we were brought up. It's in our family, right? The immigrant mentality, working two jobs, doing whatever it takes to put your kids through school to put food on the table. That's our frame of reference, right? So give me the shot, give me a shot, put me in, coach, and I can
Yeah.
do the rest of it. So that's where we are. That's Association Latinos.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, and I know in our conversation, right, and even this is partly how we met, right, was through these associations, and so I wanted to make sure we gave that the attention and that it deserved, because again, it sounded like such a significant part, but also it kind of alluded to this larger commitment to service throughout your story. Carlos, tell us about the work that you're doing now. Um, what is it that you do, and if you could project, where do you see yourself in a few years?
So the work that I do now, sad on a sad note, this is the last year for I'm the immediate past chair of the ASAE, American Society of Association Executives Tech Council. So we've got 25 volunteers, data scientists, IT directors, sometimes in the legal profession, sometimes executive directors. So we come together, we're liaisons, you could say, right, of the association profession in general. So we tried to solve association nonprofit challenges. What are the things that they should be focused on? Everybody talks about the importance of data and leveraging that, but nobody really talks about the ugly truth in terms of data's messy. You have to have a process to make sure that you validate it. You have to get to a point where it's trustworthy. Now you can start to get insights. Now you can start to do predictive analytics. Now you can feed into machine learning models. And that basically leaves you at the doorstep of generative AI and where we are today. Uh, in terms of framework selecting CRMs, in terms of technology leadership, that's the spectrum of topics that we tackle as a tech council. But not only that, and it's not just isolated, right? This organization, ASAE, has research foundations, they have foresight committees, they have membership committees, they have marketing committees. And so one of the things that I'm very proud of is the same mentality in terms of building teams and bringing people together, bringing these various committees, because you can talk about a particular organizational challenge, but from the perspective of just technology, I think is a misrepresentation. It's a missed opportunity. So having representation from membership, because guess what? We're talking data, aligns with membership retention and renewal. Having conversations with marketing, because guess what? That's an important part of retaining members. Foresight, that's an important part of leadership. Research, that's an important part in terms of making decisions, right? So, you know, I feel like I was privileged to be able to bring these people, these professionals together to have much more rich conversations that go beyond just technology. They transcend it. So again, I think in every walk of life, in every opportunity, I try to follow that same blueprint. I don't like to necessarily stay in my lane. And sometimes I get my hand slapped for that. Sometimes it's a lesson I have to learn the hard way, but that's okay, right? You live and you learn. But as long as we're able to kind of enrich the conversation, advance the profession, to me, that's a success. So that's where I kind of am right now.
Yeah.
Um, Also am privileged to be a founding board member for a Veterans Chamber of Commerce. So you've got your veteran entrepreneurs, right, who have their own challenges. We talked about separating from the military, but in terms of starting a business, right? Maybe you start a business and you have an idea, but maybe you don't have access to capital. And there's advocacy components to that. There's fundraising components to that. And there's networking components to that as well. So as a chamber, we just incorporated last year We're going about the business of strategic planning,
Mhm.
trying to put our finger on the pulse of veteran entrepreneurs, even going to advocate in terms of veteran legislation here in Springfield, in terms of that's our capital. But again, just trying to continue our service and help our fellow veterans.
Wow, you sound busy.
It's pretty busy. Sometimes my wife's like, "Hey, dude, what about me?" Yeah. So I have to find a balance. I'm not the best at it.
Yeah,
It's something that I constantly work on it.
yeah, yeah. Well, it again, yes, you sound busy, but it also sounds like you're doing, important work, right? Just as you said, you're developing teams, but it also sounds like you're developing leaders and supporting leaders. And so congratulations on the work that you're doing and your continued service to your community and to the larger community. Carlos, as we transition out, right, I always ask my guests to leave us with one piece of advice. What's one last piece of advice you'd like to offer our listeners and viewers out there?
My piece of advice would be to join a team. Again, it's easy to try to navigate life, and we touched on that before. It's easy to try to navigate life by yourself and think you have all the answers, but I think it's much more rewarding and enriching of life in general if you join a team. You join a team, and you have these conversations. There's a healthy friction that happens, right? Exchanging of ideas. Um, Not every idea is a good idea. Not every idea wins, but I feel like it basically, you hold up a mirror to yourself and say, like, well, what are the gaps in my personal self and my professional self? Um, and you don't get the benefit of that if you don't join a team. If you also join a team, again, now you have the capability and the privilege, right, to be able to maybe influence others, to help bring others along. And so the concept of teamwork is probably integrated throughout my entire life. And that's my advice. Join a team. You probably get more than you give. Easily, you get more than you give if you join a team and you volunteer.
Carlos, I couldn't agree more. I know my life and work experience, personal experiences have been enriched because of teams and my involvement in teams and in organizations. And so I appreciate the advice. I know I'm gonna reference it when working with students because anytime, like I still teach part-time, and anytime I have a class and I've got to get students together in groups or in teams, here come the sighs, here comes the I hate
Yeah.
working into, and I tell them, like, this is important, this is valuable work, and this is largely what you're going to be doing as a professional. You've got to work with other people, you're going to work in teams, and trust me, you'll be enriched by it. And so I again, one of the perks of these conversations is, to know, right, these are lessons that continue to persist and that are shared, and there's value in them across all of my guests. So thank you very much, Carlos.
Yeah, I know, that's something else, right? To consider exploring in terms of what's that trepidation in terms of joining a team. Again, you
Yeah,
expose yourself, right? And so your shortcomings are exposed to that team. And you have these team dynamics, and it goes through its various stages before you start to like click and jive. But what are some of those hesitations? Why are they scared of joining a team? Given that
yeah,
everybody talks about the benefits of it, and you know that up front, why do you still fear joining a team? That's an
yeah.
interesting conversation, I think, to explore.
I appreciate that, and I will. I'll ask my students that next time we're gonna get together and do some group work. Carlos, thank you. One, thank you for your story. Thank you for sharing your story. Yeah, I appreciate it. I know when we open up like this and sort of revisit our paths, I know it's not always easy. And so I appreciate that. And then congratulations. Congratulations on the work that you're doing. Congratulations on your persistence. And again, not staying in your lane, not adhering to these, like this happens at this point, this happens at this point. But for you, right, you said education, learning is the continued process, always learning, always striving, always, setting goals for yourself. So congratulations on all of the work that you've done for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, doctor. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my story, with your audience. And I'm a fan, I'm a listener of your podcast as well. So again, hopefully we can collaborate together in the future.
I'm counting on it, Carlos.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Well, Carlos, thank you again. This concludes another episode of the Way to College podcast. Thank you to my guest. Thank you to our listeners and viewers out there. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, follow, and as always, please share the podcast with one other person. I know I'd appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll talk again soon. Bye bye.